Vim aqui no seu podcast para te contar que com o app BitBank, o primeiro criptobanco do Brasil, você pode ter um cartão que te dá até 10% de cashback em reais, criptomoedas ou até dólar digital. A experiência é simples e intuitiva, mesmo para quem nunca investiu. Comece hoje mesmo a receber cashback em compras de qualquer valor. Acesse bit.com.br. BitBank, para você viver investindo.
Today on CityCast DC, if you are like most people, you are not a fan of brutalism. That is the 20th century architectural style known for strewing blocky concrete buildings all around DC. But a new show at the National Building Museum aims to change your mind. We talked to the curators, Angela Pearson and Ty Cole, about how DC became a showcase of brutalism and why the buildings actually have a future here. Today is Monday, August 12th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Angela.
Hey.
Hi, Ty.
Hey, Michael.
So you all did this whole exhibition on the past, present, and future of brutalist architecture in DC. I think, to put it mildly, this is a form of architecture that gets a bad rap a lot of the time. Presumably, you guys don't share that view. What do you think is beautiful about these buildings?
Well, from my standpoint, I think they're very sculptural, and they come from the modernist movement of architecture, which is my favorite. And they photograph beautifully, and I'm a photographer. So that was how I was first drawn to them.
So let's back up for a second so you can explain what is brutalism and how to get that name anyway.
That's such a great question. So when you hear the term brutalism, many of us often think it's referring to the sort of brutal or harsh looking quality of it because it is often this gray cast concrete. But actually, it comes from the term béton brut, which means raw concrete. So it's really referring to the material qualities of the architecture more so than the aesthetic or a certain aesthetic. And it's a modernist style of architecture. So modernism was really focused on trying to be true to the materials and clear in the structural expression. So brutalism is really working to be an extension of modernism. So the sort of truest form of expression where the material is the architecture.
Has anyone ever thought of a rebranding?
Brutalism needs a new publicist. And that's not us necessarily, but we're hoping folks can see it with a bit more nuance, maybe.
So in DC, you don't have to go that far to find brutalist buildings. Why are there so many of them in the Capitol?
This is such an awesome question. So if we think about the history of DC and how the federal government really expanded after World War II, so we had a rapidly growing housing and urban development department. We had the Department of Energy, which ultimately oversaw the Manhattan Project, was really growing. And so we had all these federal agencies that needed space to bring all their employees into Washington to work together under one roof. And so brutalism offered a relatively quick way, relatively inexpensive way to build these new, very large office buildings. Some of these buildings even came in under budget, which is super rare for federal architectural projects.
So it wasn't anything about the government particularly. It was just that they needed buildings at a time when this was vogue in buildings.
Yeah, that's really it. And this was happening in Europe too. So if you imagine that a lot of Europe was essentially bombed out in World War II, and they also needed to really rapidly rebuild housing and governmental infrastructure, this is really a great option. And also what was, as you said, in vogue. And something else that's pretty interesting is that the federal government had often been referencing older architectural styles as they were designing new buildings. But in the early 60s, President Kennedy had the guiding principles for federal architecture put in place, which we still use to this day. And what those principles maintained is that really it's better for the federal government to be investing in contemporary architecture, sort of working at the leading edge of architecture, as opposed to referencing decades or in some cases centuries old styles.
So for folks walking around town, can you just go through what some of the most iconic brutalist buildings in DC are?
Yeah, some of the buildings are along the mall, actually. So starting on the southeast side, the HHS building is very close to the Capitol. And directly behind that, the Weaver building. And then the Forrestal will be next. And across the street from the Forstall is the Hirshhorn. And then behind it next to Forstall and Weaver is Moffat Plaza, which is also in our show, but not one of the featured elements of the show.
So the Hirshhorn building is round. It's like a donut, minimal windows. What do the other ones look like?
So the Hirshhorn is round, and some of them have curves, but generally these buildings tend to be on the boxier side. They often have gridded windows and coffered ceilings, and there's a sort of, I would say, almost like a playbook that you could follow, but some of the architects like Marcel Breuer would get more creative with how they would facet the windows or how they would curve mirrored halves of the buildings, which is pretty interesting.
The other sort of big example of brutalism in the district is one that people don't actually complain about the looks of a lot, which is the metro system.
So the metro system was in some ways designed actually to have a cathedral-like quality. And I think that it can be pretty effective, especially in the larger stops. So for example, if you're standing underground at L'Enfant Plaza, or if you're at the Chinatown Metro, where you see these really grand vaulted coffered ceilings intersecting, and you feel that sense of scale and it's above you, it can be really quite beautiful.
So your guys' show is DC Brutalism. What attracted you to Washington of all cities? As you know, this is a global style. It happened in a lot of places. There's a lot of, in Europe, they obviously had a lot of need to build stuff after World War II. What is it about DC's architecture, or I don't know if it's the juxtaposition of brutalism with other stuff here or what, but what attracted you to it?
Yeah, the juxtaposition of brutalism with other styles it's really impressive. And I think that it's something that's quite interesting for a lot of folks from around the US who may, especially folks from out west, they may only travel to DC with their families once or twice in their lives. And so when they arrive, they might expect to see buildings like the classic Smithsonian building, so the Museum of Natural History, or the Capitol building. And then when you pop up out of that Smithsonian metro station and you see the Hirshhorn building, or across the street, the Forrestal building, it can be a little bit jarring. And so we really wanted to tell the story of how these buildings came to be, why there's such a concentration of them, and then also scratch the surface and talk a little bit about how the architects really were trying to do something great and meaningful, and they didn't imagine themselves making spaces that people wouldn't enjoy. They really thought that they were contributing to the urban environment.
Você que tá aí ouvindo o podcast, sabia que o poder de construir a carreira profissional dos seus sonhos também está em suas mãos? Na pós-graduação do Senac, você encontra diversos cursos com 12 meses de duração, além de estudar com aulas presenciais mais EAD. E tem mais, o TCC é opcional. Tudo isso para você conciliar trabalho, estudos e vida social. Quer mais? Você também pode ter até 50% de desconto. Confira as condições no site sp.senac.br/pós-graduação. Quer saber? Senac.
Enquanto você curte um som, a ClearSale cuida da segurança antifraude de mais de 100 mil empresas em todo o mundo. Só falta a sua. Fale com os nossos especialistas e fique um passo à frente das fraudes e riscos de crédito. Encontre soluções flexíveis que se adaptam às necessidades da sua empresa e garanta múltiplas camadas de proteção em cada transação. ClearSale, one step ahead.
So you mentioned the guiding principles for architecture that under President Kennedy, they ordered that federal architects should try to present the best of cutting-edge American architecture. This has become, in the last few years, a controversial thing. There's mostly Republicans, a lot of them with the ear of Donald Trump, have sought to mandate quote-unquote classical architecture as the default style for new federal buildings. In D.C., they particularly have it in for brutalism and want to rewrite the rules to set them against brutalism. What do you make of that?
I think those are waters that we've tried to stay out of, but we have two things that we like to reference. So first is that the American Institute of Architects is opposed to any sort of legislation that would require architects to only design in reference to past styles or styles that honestly emerged outside of the US. So like the French Beaux-Arts, if we're referencing that's not necessarily contemporary or American. So I think it's pretty interesting. That's where the AIA has chosen to come out, and they came out quite forcefully. Another thing that we really like to pay attention to is the idea that if we were to update these buildings, that's really the most sustainable way forward for the government. Tearing them down is quite expensive, it's quite resource intensive, and the most sustainable building you have is one that's already been built.
And as part of your show, you ask architecture firms to reimagine some of these classic brutalist buildings, the Hirshhorn, the Robert C. Weaver Federal Building, the Humphrey Building, and the Library at Georgetown, the Lounger. Oh, and the FBI's Hoover Building, which is in deep trouble already. Tell me about some of the wildest reimaginings that people turned in.
I want to start out by saying that really this is Ty's idea. A couple of years ago, he was like, I know we want to tell the history and we want to photograph the buildings, but what if we thought about their futures too? And so I want to give a nod to Ty for this awesome idea.
Thanks, Angela. When we came up with this idea, I actually didn't know that Dillis Scofidio had already designed the bubble for Hirshhorn, and Gensler had designed the hackable building for the FBI building, which was great because we were able to reach out to them and they donated all the material to our show. And then we extended the invitation to Brooke Scarpa in California, Jenny Gang in Chicago, and Build Us in a two-person local firm in DC. And also the students at UNLV had a contest that we chose a winner to be on the show. They're all so different. One I loved is about Build This for the Humphrey Building. They turned it into a fictional department of play, which they created a faux press release from the White House that stated the new initiative for the Department of Play. And they turned the building, basically gutted it and turned it into a huge playground and put a temple on top or a pyramid on top and described it as the Temple of Play. That was a more fun one that we really loved, and illustrations that came along with it.
Were any of the ideas actually viable?
I think that in some way or another, they all are pretty viable, even the Temple of Play. And I think that's something that's really fascinating about these brutalist buildings is that they have so much structural integrity that they're really quite adaptable. The expense is another question, of course, but I think that overall, they're really adaptable. One of the wilder concepts, which is the Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro Hirshhorn bubble concept that Ty mentioned earlier, was actually designed to be built. The DSR was under contract with the Smithsonian Institution, working with the Hirshhorn Museum to actually inflate a multi-story bubble inside that round Hirshhorn Museum's inner ring. And this went on for about 4 years, back and forth with the Smithsonian, trying to price it, figure out how feasible it would be. And ultimately, due to cost concerns, the project was scrapped. And there were all sorts of fascinating, sort of tongue-in-cheek headlines, like the Hirshhorn bubble's been popped and all that. But all along, the intent was really to be able to construct this thing and have it up for a few months every year in perpetuity, which is pretty amazing.
So a lot of these buildings are downtown. And for those of us who live here, we have been in the middle of a conversation in the last year or two about the future of downtown. So much of downtown, including these brutalist buildings, were built as office buildings. And the nature of work has changed. People don't come in to work as much. There's a lot of fear for the economy downtown. And there's a lot of hope that we can maybe somehow turn these office blocks into residential blocks, perhaps by completely converting the buildings from office to residential. Do you think the city can learn anything from this exhibit and these designs about the path forward?
Absolutely. I think that there's lessons that can be learned from several of the designs. So I would first point to the Brooke Scarpa adaptive reuse project for the Weaver building. So that's the current home to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what they're proposing is converting it to over 300 affordable residential units. So this would be just south of the mall, over 300 units, and also adding in some mixed residential, retail, places to eat. So really enlivening that part of the mall that can be often quite dead and there's not a lot of housing there. Studio Gang has also proposed the Forrestal building, which is immediately south of the mall and crosses over 10th Street and blocks views from the L'Enfant Promenade to the mall. They've proposed actually removing that section that crosses over 10th Street and repurposing those large window panels, which could just be taken down and moved to other places in the city and used to actually fabricate affordable housing elsewhere. So there's some really novel means of not only reusing the buildings in place, but also repurposing their sort of structural units in other parts of the city.
What I'd heard about how difficult it is to turn office buildings, most office buildings, into residential ones is particularly the ones in DC. They're square, and so you don't have you'd have a lot of rooms without windows or without much light. But that HUD building, which sort of looks like, I don't know, like an open book or something, would that work differently? Is there more opportunity for light?
Structurally, I think so. And when they Brooke Scott proposed removing the core of it, which would only bring in more light to the center part of it. So I agree that to that point of making it not so cavernous, I think it's one of the better opportunities to create a more open light field space.
So the other thing that we have been talking about in DC the last couple of years is the future of the FBI building. And there's a consensus it's got to go. That consensus, I don't think, is based on like architectural criticism. It's that the building is like literally pieces are falling off of it. And I'm curious, is this kind of disrepair? I mean, do brutalist buildings hold up less well than some of the older ones that have stood the test of time? Or is whatever's wrong there unique to that building?
I think that's a great question. I can't speak to the structural integrity of that building alone, but I will say that many of these buildings can last for decades to come. And in the case of the Hirshhorn, they reclad it with granite from the original quarry in Maine. And so I think that it demonstrates this opportunity for updating these buildings for years to come and the possibilities that are there for really being active in the maintenance.
But it does bring us to this sort of question of preservation, which is a big deal in a city with as much historic resonance as Washington. And when a building has historic significance, but people don't seem to like it very much, like the FBI, should it be preserved? And what do you make of the questions about preserving brutalist buildings, even when they are not popular with the average person on the street?
I think adapting them into something that's more accessible to the public, but as far as erasing them from existence, I think it's important. It's an important evolution in architectural history, and I think that is worth saving. And it does tell a story of maybe it was a mistake in some regard, but maybe keeping them around, we'll learn our lesson. Tastes are different, obviously, but I think it's important to, you don't want to, I think erasing part of that history, it would be a mistake.
Angela, Ty, thank you guys for being here, and congrats on the show. It runs through February at the National Building Museum. Is that right?
Yeah, through February.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks so much, Michael.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, go scream about it at your nearest brutalist building. You can rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.